Hello, I'm going to record a weekly lecture at the end of the week after you've done your writing. The reason I'm doing that instead of doing it earlier is because I want you guys to be working towards figuring out the text and making it mean something slowly but surely. I know these are all challenging, as we've discussed before. The idea of the three things assignment is to give you sort of a place to sort of grab onto things you don't understand and look them up, and then going back and doing a second reading for the response on the discussion board is designed to have you read it a little bit more deeply and try to pick out major ideas and concepts and have a discussion with your classmates about what some of those are. And then on Fridays, I'll make sure that there's a lecture posted every Friday so that you can look into the essay a little bit more deeply and any things that you guys didn't catch on your own or things that are more rhetorical that I wouldn't necessarily expect you to pick up on your own, at least not initially, are the things that I wanted to comment on. So I have a couple slides. The lecture won't be very long here, but focusing on some of the rhetorical elements of this piece as well as some of the thematic things that go with the course. I've chosen, all the essays that I've chosen for this course are connected all around the idea of sort of the individual within a culture or within a society, how we balance the public and the private or the personal versus the larger community that we're a part of. So I wanted to make sure that those things get brought out, and so that's what the lectures are going to try to do. The rhetorical issues in this essay are things that if you think about the structural elements that you may be familiar with from, if you think back to 102, Comp 2, you may have discussed these things in that class. That class was an argument and research-based class, but we also talked a lot about rhetorical strategies in that class, and most faculty emphasize that pretty heavily. So things like purpose and audience, rhetorical strategies, choice of language, what sort of examples are used, what's the structure, what kind of claims are being made, what sort of support and evidence is being used, emphasis on logos, ethos, and pathos. All of those elements are things that you can apply to virtually any piece of writing. This piece raises some interesting questions, and I want to make clear that not all of the pieces that we're reading are, demonstrably argumentative the way that the things you might have read in 102 were. But they all still do raise these questions. So we want to step back from what the essay is about for a moment and talk about how she makes the choices she makes. And I saw in the comments that some of you felt really frustrated by some of her choices. There was a real resistance on the part of a couple of you, kind of just, what does she think she's doing? I don't like her language choices. I don't like the, how wordy it is. I don't think it makes any sense, that kind of stuff. I get that. I get that this is a challenging essay. It might be the hardest of all of them, actually. And it's deliberate for me to have chosen it first. I'm moving you towards things that'll be a little more accessible. Those things toward the end, they're a little bit easier to read. We tend to think of them as easy, and I want to kind of complicate that for you a little bit by having you read difficult things first so that you're sort of, it's kind of like working out, you work on a little harder in the beginning, and then, when you do more challenging things later, they may not be so difficult, or even if you go to something easier, you kind of understand it better. So that's what I'm hoping for here. Okay, so the occasion for the essay, or the lecture more appropriately, as I'm sure you all picked up, is that she's speaking in front of the MLA, which is the Modern Language Association. So she's speaking to other academics. She makes that very clear early on. She has a passage where she talks about that, where after she talks about her son, she switches over to talking about Guam and Poma. In between there, she makes a little transition where she says, well, I would, you all are expecting me to be abstract and to talk about big concepts, I'm summarizing. So that's what I'm going to do, and that's exactly what she does. So the occasion for the essay is important. She's talking to people who are scholarly, who are professors. So they're both capable of understanding the difficult language. They're experts in the same field she is, which is, modern languages. She's a professor of Spanish. The idea of culture is deeply embedded in the understanding of those things, especially at the higher levels of academia. The longer you go to school, the more you study, the more richly you would study language and study about culture and the literature and all that kind of stuff, not just learning the words and learning the grammar. These are people who also are teachers and are interested in the acquisition of language skills. They're interested in how people learn foreign languages, in particular in her case, because she's talking about that. MLA has kind of two subsections. One is sort of English professors, and the other major group is people who teach foreign languages. Although there's a lot of blending, of that. It's not necessarily this huge distinction, but there are sort of tracks within MLA. So obviously she's talking more to people who are foreign language acquisition specialists, but still, even somebody who's a specialist in English literature and language is going to find what she's saying to be stuff that they already understand on some level. And so she's trying to raise some issues and provide some insights for people who already know a lot about the broader base of what she's talking about. They understand about the idea of, the difficulties of teaching. They understand about, the idea of the classroom, what she calls a contact zone. They already understand that on some level, although she's trying to provide them with a different point of view. Okay, so that's the occasion for the lecture. That has something to do with the audience. The audience for this in the speech part of it, when she's making a speech, of course, is that particular group. It was also published as a written text in a journal and then reproduced for us here. So then the audience becomes a little bit different. So the second audience for this after the lecture is probably an academic audience in a journal, in an academic journal. So it's again roughly the same audience, although a broader one than the people who are actually at the conference. But still people within the discipline who would be interested and who would understand and who might, or people like graduate students who would be struggling to understand but kind of willing to sort of push themselves to learn it. Once our authors, the editors of our textbook, pick it up and put it in a book for undergraduates, there's a shift in audience. It's not her original audience anymore that is looking at this. Now people like you who are undergraduate students are reading this essay, and a professor might pick this up in a class just by itself and choose to have students read it. But then it becomes a different situation. So then what we're doing is, the reason I'm having you read this is I'm trying to sort of show you this is the academic language. This is what college talk is about. This is how professors talk to each other, how graduate students talk to each other. This is the kind of thing that goes on. And I want you guys to understand that's part of what it is. You are a part of that community of language, which is one of the things she talks about at the end of her essays, even if you don't recognize that quite in that way. When professors talk about subjects to undergraduate students, they talk about it in one way because they understand that they're not talking to an expert audience. When they talk to graduate students, they talk about it in a slightly different way because those students are like, I don't know, what's the word? If you think about like the old apprentice system, it's like undergraduates would be similar to apprentices, beginners, people who are starting to learn this stuff. Graduate students would be like journeymen, sort of in the middle. They've become, pretty adept at what they're doing, and then professors might be like masters of whatever it is that they're doing. There also, of course, there's that level. So what I'm trying to show you by sharing these essays with you, that a lot of which are written for an academic community or a highly educated community, is how you are a part of that learning community. You are a part of that environment, and it's good for you to see and understand what other aspects of it are, except for the ones beyond the ones that are focused directly on you. So her language choices are not focused on you. They're focused on people who are of her same level of education and of her profession, that is other professors. And people who would attend MLA are all pretty much professors, with a few grad students occasionally, but very rarely. I mean, it's mostly faculty who attend it. So, so the choices that she's making here, she jumps in and out, and that's something that should be clear. There are segments of this that are much more challenging in terms of the language that she's using, and other pieces that are much more clear. And you may have noticed that when she's talking about her children, she's talking about something in a much clearer format. At the beginning, when she's talking about her son and the baseball cards, but also toward the end, where she's talking about her other son and the way that he resists the assignment. Kind of includes his own, or sort of puts his own sort of spin on it, and is humorous and sort of insightful about the assignment, and kind of playing to the audience, but that's never acknowledged, of course, when it's graded. And that's something that, as a faculty member, that's something that you would think about. Students may or may not think about that. Although you should probably be aware that sometimes students are resistant to assignments as well. I mean, if you're a student, you've probably resisted an assignment at least once in your life. I know I certainly did, and I see it in my own students all the time. And that's some of else what she's talking about here. The various examples and pieces, some of you complained about that and were frustrated by her jumping from topic to topic, because she really does cover, about 4 major things here. Her son with the baseball cards, Guam and Poma, and the concept of the contact zone. Then she moves on to the idea of her, I can't, now I'm trying to remember which order they were in at the end. I just read this morning again. The thing about her other son and the way that he's sort of resisting assignments, and then the discussion about the curriculum change at Stanford and teaching a course where nobody is marginalized and all of the students are shown in the light of their own histories being both valorized, i.e., important, made important, and as being critiqued at the very same time, and so that it becomes a place where everybody is sort of looked at in that way, rather than some people being marginalized and not really in the story, and other people being made into heroes or whatever. So one of the things she's trying to do there with these 4 different pieces is to have a larger subject. Now, if I were to ask you what this essay is about, I suspect that I would get different answers. Some of you would say this essay is about Guam and Poma. And, or some of you would say this essay is about a guy who wrote a text in 2 languages and was trying to communicate with a king in a far off land. Some of you would say it's about literacy. Some of you would say it's about the contact zone. So there's all these different possible ways that you can read it. It's challenging to sort of determine if there's one sort of narrow subject, and that's a good thing, because we don't want to necessarily reduce an essay down to just a sentence of theme. That's something that often happens, especially in high school instruction, when we're trying to teach people how to read and understand stories and essays and whatever. And by doing that, I think we oversimplify them. That's not the point. If the point of an essay were 1 sentence, people would write 1 sentence. The point is to make a richer, more complex point that is more involved. And even though students often complain about that, a good rich idea can't be reduced to 1 sentence or a paragraph. So excuse me. So what is the subject of this essay? I would say the subject is the interplay between the powerful person and the person without power, is one of the things she's trying to talk about here, which is why there's a connection between Guam and Poma and students in this piece. The idea that Guam and Poma is a person who is not speaking his own language, but is trying to learn the language of the power structure, just as students are trying to learn the language of the power structure of school. And so her reference to her son and learning to become literate and how he's decoding language, her reference to her other son and the way he's sort of pushing back against the assignment with trying to be humorous and seeing what he can kind of get away with to some degree, makes him kind of like Guam and Poma in that he's sort of resisting and kind of, making a subtle critique in some way of what the assignment is about. And the idea of changing curriculum and trying to bring in more, represent more of what students are about and where they come from in a classroom, so that it isn't just, the dead white guy's approach to literature and culture, which is the way that, history, literary subjects, philosophy, all those things were taught for a very long time. The idea of incorporating the voices of women, the voices of people of color, those things matter. And so that's one of the things that she's trying to get across here. Okay, I'm going to move on to my next topic. So one of the things I want you to think about here, and of course it bled over a little bit from the discussion of rhetoric, because it's really hard to separate rhetoric from content, is that I want you to be thinking here about culture and identity issues in the text. So if we look at Guam and Poma, we want to think about him. We don't know anything much about him personally. We know that he tells us that his half-brother was half Spanish and had a Spanish father, and he taught him Spanish. So that's why he's writing half in Spanish and half in Quechua, which is his native language. That's all we really know about him as an individual subject. But we also know that he's a person who felt that there were grievances that he had, and that weren't just personal, but sort of grievances of his people that should be brought to the attention of the King of Spain. So he's writing politically and publicly, not as a private individual. And we're not like, reading about his marriage and his kids and his job and, how he feels about things. He's writing as a representative of the Andean culture that he's a part of. So, so he's representing himself as, here I am. I'm a man who lives in this place, and I want to bring to your attention some of the things, some of the outrages that I have seen. And I think that's an interesting point. So this piece doesn't really show us Guaman Poma as, a richly individual person with an interior life and all that kind of stuff. We'll see that later when we read some other things. We'll be moving in that direction as we read along. But I wanted to point that out, that this is a piece that is, if you were to sort of look at it as a continuum between the individual and the culture, this piece is very much more about the culture, more on that end of the scale. And in fact, the culture that it's about is this mestizo culture, which is, mestizo is a word that Pratt uses, and if any of you looked it up, I don't recall if you did or not, but if you looked it up, mestizo means a person of mixed European and Native American race. So the culture of Central and South America, and even in the Western United States, is very much a mestizo culture. The intermingling of those people, especially in South and Central America. Mexicans, for example, are largely mestizo people. Most of the people who live in South America are as well. So what he's showing us with his text is this idea of, sort of what one of the other words that that Pratt uses, a heterogeneous. So it has elements of Quechua and Indian culture. It has elements of Spain and Spanish culture. The idea of the drawings are a good example of this, and Pratt makes the point that, that there aren't really many examples in Andean, Incan traditional art of representational art. So this idea of drawing men and, on horses and, with the sun over them and all that kind of thing isn't something that you see in Inca art or in Indian culture very often. But it's something that came from the Spanish texts that Guaman Poma must have seen. And so he's trying to represent back something that isn't native to him. So that's a perfect example of what mestizo would be about. Okay, he's trying to get across an idea, represent things that are happening in a visual language through his drawings that is not native to him, as well as the blending of the languages, which is another important piece of that, of course, and it's more obvious, but you see where I'm going with that. Okay, then she's talking, of course, about this idea of literacy and the contact zone, as a larger topic, and then of course, with her sons and all that, and Guaman Poma trying to master the language of the colony, of the colonizer, so that he can talk to him in that language, but not able to do it fluently. His Spanish is difficult, and then having the Quechua in there, where this Spanish king probably isn't going to know Quechua, shows somebody who is, feels moved to make this attempt, but is ultimately not going to get it across. And of course, she makes the point that you have to see the text as, in some ways, failing to meet its point, because probably it was never read by the person it was intended for. I mean, it was found, all these years later in a museum, and no one looked at it, and it was, 350 years before anybody even really ever tried to comment on it. Now, of course, we don't know if anyone had ever looked at it and read it before that, but the only record we would have is if some scholarly person like Peachman, the guy she writes about, decides to take it up and write about the text and tell us about it. Otherwise, I mean, think about it. There's documents all over the world, hanging out in libraries and in archives that no one's looked at in hundreds of years because nobody is writing about them. If no one sees them, they're not having any impact. And so that's one of the things that the essay kind of, in a sort of subtle way brings up as well. The idea that, here you feel the need to express something, but if you don't have an audience for it, are you really making contact in the contact zone? I mean, it's an interesting document, but if it doesn't make its point, how successful is it, is a question that she's sort of raising. And then finally, she's talking about that, she's transferring the idea from literacy into school and saying, as academics and as teachers, it's our job to make sure that school hears those voices, we hear what students have to tell us about their own experience, and that we recognize and appreciate that. At the same time, we're trying to expose students to things that they do not know. School isn't really useful if all you do is reinforce what kids already know. or college students for that matter. A school is supposed to challenge you. It's supposed to take you out of your comfort zone. It's supposed to show you things you don't already know. And so if it's not doing that, if you're just learning stuff that doesn't challenge you at all, doesn't make you think, doesn't make you uncomfortable, then you're really not probably being exposed to anything new. And so the idea is that school, by in and of itself, is a contact zone if it's done correctly, because it's intended to sort of have this sort of clashing back and forth. It isn't always. School can also be an oppressive institution, which is about, here you must know this and this is how you have to understand it. It's up to an individual faculty and the school sort of as an institution, which of course the faculty have a tremendous impact on, to make school be about that, to make it be about a contact zone, a place where we hear from students and we understand what they're telling us, and we try to like expose them to other things beyond what they already know, as well as honoring what they bring to us. And so that's one of the things she's trying to get across here as an important point. It's sort of the largest point that she's trying to make at the end of her essay. Okay, that's pretty much what I have to say about that for now. There are many more options and many other ways that this could be discussed. Obviously, there are many other things that could be focused on, but I wanted to kind of get out those points just to give you something to grab onto. In the next two essays I picked the three, the essays in this class are arranged in groups. So there's a group of three, there's a group of three, there's a group of two at the end. I think it's two. I want to say it's two. Yeah, because the first week was the introduction. Yeah. So a group of three, and a group of two. And they're intended that way. They're intended to be seen. I want you to be thinking about them in, sort of in interconnection with one another. Next week's essay by Jane Tompkins is about Indians and history. And it has a lot of linkages back to Pratt. So you might be thinking of that as you're reading Tompkins. And then the week after that, we're going to read the French philosopher Foucault, who's hugely influential on the academic world for sure, and his essay called Panopticism, about the state versus the individual, and sort of the the idea of like control of individuality. And so all of these have to do with the idea of sort of people who are voiceless versus the power structure. And so that's what we're talking about in this first grouping. I just want you to think about that as we move forward. Okay, I'll be back next week with another lecture, and I will be providing you with emailed feedback on the assignments that you've turned in this week.